Welcome to this session in which we're going to look at issues and debates in psychology of addiction. We've seen a range of issues in previous sessions. For example, we looked at the issue of insight versus action in different forms of therapy. We've looked at the idea of whether addiction is a disease or not. Is it necessary to study the effects of drugs on the brain? Other issues, for example, are what kind of cognitive processes are involved in addiction? What role does the environment have? What type of learning might be involved in addiction? These are just some of the many issues that are currently being looked at within the psychology of addiction. We saw this slide in an earlier session, but I would just like to look at it again. It's from the government's Brain Science Addiction Project, published in 2005, in which it talks about experimental psychology as being ideally placed to analyze and understand addiction. And it makes the point that the major strength of experimental psychology is that it provides objective, precise, and testable explanations of behavior by systematically deconstructing complex human behavior, such as drug addiction. But by deconstructing them in this experimental way, are we losing the essence of understanding addiction? This is a very different deconstructing to the approach that we looked at in a previous session where we looked at the work of Philip Harland, which is rooted in non-experimental approaches to psychology. So one debate is it right to focus so much on experimental psychology? Certainly there are useful insights from experimental psychology. For example, the Rat Park experiments tell us a lot about the role of the environment. So that's one debate, which is how important is it to focus on experimental psychology at the expense of other approaches? This is another paper that we've also looked at before, but I'd like to look at it again and think about how important are psychological treatments for addiction. We know that many people don't have psychological treatments for addiction. They often just have purely pharmacological treatments. And yet Tomasello says that non-pharmacological interventions, in other words, psychological interventions, represent the Achilles heel in addiction treatment. They are part of the recovery process, often overlooked or ignored by patients and healthcare providers. So one of the reasons is perhaps that there are many different types of non-pharmacological interventions, and so perhaps that makes it difficult to decide which is the correct one. Also, they're not as quick as pharmacological interventions. So we've looked at a range of different approaches, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step approach, psychoanalysis, and so on. So there's quite a bewildering choice, and the evidence base is not easy to interpret. So the question is how if are they essential, and how would you go about selecting the right one? These are the current knowledge. It's difficult to answer, and we also saw it's difficult to take some of these psychological approach, for example, those based on spiritual guidance that we looked at, and turn it into something that can just be easily incorporated into the treatment process. Going back to the Foresight report that we mentioned earlier, it talks about fMRI scanning and how that's enabled us to identify the neural basis for human reward systems. And it goes on to say that these discoveries have enormous potential for identifying abnormal reward circuits in people and for identifying effective mechanisms for correcting these changes. So that was in 2005. 15 years later, has this promise been realized, or, as we've discussed throughout this module, is looking at the brain the correct way of looking at addiction, or does it need to be complemented or even replaced by other ways of understanding addiction? This is a figure taken from the report in which we see addiction conceptualized in terms of the brain. We have the distinction between the non-addicted brain and the addicted brain. So very much an all or nothing process. You're either non-addicted or you're addicted. And the way that the authors conceptualize it is that it's the same basic processes, but they operate in different ways for those who are non-addicted compared to those that are addicted. And I think the question is it right to focus on the brain, or should we, as we have done elsewhere in the module, focus on the whole person? Which is the path that's most likely to lead to an understanding of addiction? I would just like to quote something from the report, which concerns the promise of brain research for developing non-addictive drugs. And the report says, excuse me, if we can develop an accurate mechanism for determining individual susceptibilities, vulnerabilities, and responsibilities, it might be possible to envisage a society in which people were screened and then provided with a perfectly tailored range of treatments to ensure optimal performance and enjoyment, with a guarantee of no negative side effects or addiction. So these are all issues that you might want to think about in relation to the range of materials that we've been looking at throughout this module. Here's an example from experimental psychology where behavior may be explained by a hypothetical brain mechanism. So how does the drug methylphenidate work? Methylphenidate is a stimulant drug, and it's given to children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So why would you give a stimulant to children who may already be overstimulated? So this may be explained by the Yerkes-Dodson principle. The Yerkes-Dodson principle dictates that performance increases with physiological or mental arousal, but only up to a point. When levels of arousal become too high, performance decreases. So we can see that principle here. Here we have low arousal, and if you give people a stimulant, their performance increases because it increases their arousal up to this point here. So the effect of methylphenidate on different groups was reported in this study here. Mehta showed that the beneficial effects of methylphenidate on working memory in normal adult volunteers were greatest in those subjects with lower baseline working memory capacity, which we could equate with lower arousal, although that's not explicitly stated in the paper. So here we have people with low memory capacity or arousal. You give them methylphenidate and their performance increases. However, the opposite effect was noticed in children with ADHD. It was those with the highest scores for baseline working memory capacity who demonstrated the greatest improvement in spatial working memory. So in other words, this group of people are up here. You give them methylphenidate, and what it does is it pushes them back down to this point here. So that's the hypothetical mechanism by which methylphenidate may be effective for children with ADHD. Here is another example from a paper called The Cognitive Underpinnings of Addiction, and this makes use of something called a conditional reasoning measure, which was developed to evaluate the role of implicit biases in perpetuating addictive behavior. A cognitive bias is a pattern of deviation whereby inferences about people's behavior may be drawn in an illogical fashion. Individuals create their own version of reality from their perception of the input. Thus, cognitive biases may sometimes lead to what's broadly called irrational behavior. So in this task, data were collected in 2005 from two samples, individuals with a known history of chemical dependencies and individuals from the general population. And the results indicated a strong correlation between overall test scores and group membership. The findings suggest that addiction-prone individuals do rely on a distinct set of cognitive biases that rationalize their self-destructive behavior. Conditional reasoning methodology takes an innovative approach to personality measurement by indirectly evaluating the cognitive biases associated with specific dispositional traits. Bowler identified 5 justification mechanisms related to substance use and abuse: evasion of discomfort bias, immediate gratification bias, negative self-bias, self-revision bias, and the displacement of responsibility bias. And these are discussed in more detail in their paper. Let's look at one of the items that was used to investigate the displacement of responsibility bias. The item shown here outlines the health risks associated with smoking, as well as the benefits of abstaining, and subjects are asked to choose from one of the 4 options shown here. So here we see a scenario explaining why cigarette smoking is dangerous, and then asking which of the following is the most logical explanation of why people continue to smoke. And there are 4 options, and you might consider that there are other options, but this one is particularly concerned with the displacement of responsibility bias. So an inference is required in order to explain why people continue to smoke and the evidence about harm. Because reasoning is conditional on the strength of an individual biases, the perceived rationality of each option varies as a function of an individual's disposition. So what appears logical to an addiction-prone individual may be regarded as irrational by a non-addiction-prone individual. Individuals must eliminate the illogical alternatives A and D and then select a reasonable explanation for the behaviour. So A and D in this example are considered illogical. Alternative B illustrates the displacement of responsibility bias. As addiction-prone individuals are inclined to view addiction as involuntary and themselves as powerless to control addictive behaviour, B appears to be the most viable explanation because it's compatible with their reasoning process. In contrast, non-addiction-prone individuals view themselves as capable of regulating their own activities, and they gravitate towards C. So we talked about this issue of feeling of self-efficacy before, but here's an interesting experimental task that's used to investigate this phenomena. And as we saw, the results show that people that are more prone to addiction have a distinct set of cognitive biases. Of course, we all have unconscious cognitive biases. This table lists some of them. One well-known one is the fundamental attribution error. This is a tendency for people to overemphasize personality-based explanations for behavior observed in others. At the same time, individuals underemphasize the role and power of situational emphases on the same behavior. Because of the fundamental attribution error, we tend to believe that others do bad things because they're bad people. We're inclined to ignore situational factors that might have played a role. So there are many different types of cognitive biases. That's one of the most well-known ones. Fundamental attribution error was studied by Jones and Harris in a classic experiment in 1967. Subjects listened to pro- and anti-Fidel Castro speeches. At that time, Fidel Castro was the leader of Cuba. When the subjects believed that the speech makers freely chose which position to take, they rated the people who gave the pro-Castro speeches as having a more positive attitude towards Castro. When told that the speech makers gave either a pro or an anti-Castro speech solely as the result of a coin flip, subjects still rated the people who gave the pro-Castro speeches as having a more positive attitude towards Castro than those who gave anti-Castro speeches. Why is this of relevance to addiction? Well, let's just look at the experimental task first. Despite being made aware that the target speech direction, pro or anti-Castro, was assigned to the speaker participants ignored the situational pressures and attributed pro-Castro speeches to the speaker, with his speech represented such attitudes. In other words, the subjects were unable to properly see the influence of the situational constraints placed upon the speakers. They could not refrain from attributing the beliefs to the speakers. So why is this relevant to addiction? This is the topic of a book by John Davis called The Myth of Addiction. And Davis says, generally we make attribution errors about the causes of addiction, attributing it to a chronic disease rather than elements of choices and the meaning that people give to addiction. And this is something I explored in an earlier presentation. You can see more detail of it there. This idea of attribution is really very important in understanding addiction. As Shaler says in his 2000 book, Addiction is a Choice, today just about everyone believes that addicts are driven by an irresistible compulsion, a recognized disease, except those who actually know something about the subject. So what he's basically saying is there is a fundamental attribution error about the causes of addiction. And really it's more to do with cognition and choice rather than the disease model. And this is something that we've looked at throughout this module. Shaler goes on to say that the credo of the dominant addiction model is first of all that it is a disease, second of all that it requires treatment, and thirdly that physiology or genetics determine if somebody is an addict. Psychology is not really considered that important, and yet, as he points out, thinking and motivation are considered to be critical in the recovery process, and yet at the same time they're considered immaterial. So what he's saying is that there's a contradiction at the heart of the addiction model. Shaler then goes on to look at two issues. One is the issue of control, and the other is the issue of psychological factors in general. And he quotes a number of experiments. We'll just look at one of them here. In the first experiment by Engel and Williams, they found that the desire for alcohol increased when alcoholics were told that they had consumed alcohol, though in fact they had not. So in the study, alcoholics received a strongly flavoured vitamin drink, half with and half without vodka. Half of each group were told that they were drinking alcohol, and the other half that they were not. The alcoholics then rated their desire for alcohol. The conclusion of the authors was that the desire for alcohol was related to what the alcoholics were told that they were drinking and not what they had actually drunk. Thus, he argued, in humans, ethanol exposure does not directly trigger craving for more alcohol. It also depends on psychological factors. He concludes the chapter by saying that there is extensive evidence for psychological factors in addiction and no empirical evidence corroborating loss of control. And as we've seen before, this idea of loss of control is central to most people's concept of addiction. So these findings are very interesting in relation to looking at that topic. Another aspect of beliefs about addiction is in relation to drug services. Shaler reports that the stronger treatment providers believe that addicts cannot recover from addiction without treatment, the stronger the belief in the addiction model. Although I think this statement could also be read the other way around. The stronger the belief in the addiction model, the stronger the belief that addicts cannot recover from addiction without treatment. Either way, it shows the importance of people's fundamental beliefs about the addiction model. Shaler also reports that addiction treatment providers believe that about 25% of addicts recover without treatment. He doesn't explicitly link this to beliefs about addiction, but I would assume that this is also related to beliefs about addiction. Another topic which Shaler looks at in chapter 9 of the book is which type of treatment is best, or indeed is no type of treatment the best. The chapter is entitled The Project Match Cover-Up. Project Match began in 1998 1989 in the United States. It was an 8-year multi-site investigation that studied which type of alcoholics respond best to which form of treatment. MATCH studied whether treatment should be uniform or assigned to patients based on specific needs and characteristics. The programs are administered by psychotherapists. 3 types of treatment were investigated: cognitive behavioral coping skills therapy, motivational enhancement therapy, and 12 steps facilitation administered as an independent treatment designed to familiarize patients with the AA philosophy. The study concluded that patient treatment matching is not necessary in alcoholism because the 3 techniques are equally effective. So in summary, Project Match showed that no type of treatment for alcohol is better or worse than any other. It also made no difference whether the treatment was free, i.e. a self-help group, or expensive. However, there was no comparison with non-treatment. According to Project Match, there was excellent overall outcomes, but there was no control group receiving no treatment. Dr. Stanton Peele criticised Project Match on the basis that there was no control group to determine whether the treatments were more effective than natural recovery. Peele states that Project Match failure to confirm a matching hypothesis revealed more about its oversight into their methods, as well as showing that the conception of alcoholism and treatment was fundamentally wrong. He went on to say, divide the money spent on Project Match by the number of alcoholics matched treatment, then give this money to a new group of alcoholics and see how much they improve without any professionals in sight. So that's why there's this controversy about Project Match. Essentially, it involves around the fact that there was no comparison with a non-treatment group, which you might think is an acceptable thing to do depending on your conception of addiction. The textbooks for the course is The Psychology of Addictive Behavior by Moss and Dyer. One of the main themes of the book is the idea that addiction involves problems of self-control. They quote an experiment regarding the temptation to drink and the effect that this has on self-control. So the stronger the temptation to drink, in other words, using energy to resist the temptation to drink, the poorer the performance on other self-control tasks. So resisting the temptation of drinking appears to undermine self-control capacity. So the issues that this raises is self-regulation a limited resource? Do we only have so much of it to go around? And if so, is this why addicts have problems controlling their behavior? So chapter 5 of the book concerns automatic cognitive processing, and the authors return to the theme of the automatic processes versus controlled processes that we've talked about before. One of the studies that they quote is the study by Nisbet and Wilson, who reported on experiments in which subjects verbally explained why they had a particular preference. They found that we have access to the outcomes of our cognitive processes, our beliefs and our attitudes, but to quote them, little or no introspective access to the higher order cognitive processes. And in some interesting experiments, they also found that people tend to wrongly reconstruct their thought processes leading up to a particular beliefs. And I'm just wondering whether this could have an effect on processes like cognitive behavioral therapy and clean language, which are asking people to think about the addiction processes. So I don't think that's been the subject of any research, but clearly it's an important fact that people are not correctly thinking about their cognitive processes. And of course, there's also the issue of cognitive biases that we've talked about already. So if you remember, the Foresight Brain Project talked about experimental psychology as being ideally placed to determine the processes involved in addiction. And here I've turned it into a question. So I think we've seen some interesting results from experimental psychology. but I don't think we should focus completely on experimental psychology. There are clearly other branches of psychology that are not experimental. For example, psychoanalysis, which potentially also have a great deal to offer addiction. However, in terms of this particular project, they only chose to focus on experimental psychology, and it would appear that many of the processes involved in addiction may benefit from other branches of psychology. Finally, let's just reflect on some of the issues that have been raised during this module. So we saw that in the current dominant view, addiction is regarded as a disease requiring treatment. The cause of addiction is the effect of drugs in the brain, and this is where research should be focused. The alternative view is that addiction is not a disease, but rather a meaningful activity that involves understanding the reasons for the choices that people make. Addictive behavior may be a free choice, but the choices may be constrained by a range of factors that we've looked at, for example, cognitive biases, learning, unconscious processes, and self-regulation. The key factor in changing addictive behavior may be motivation and/or cognitive reframing. However, there could be the underlying issues that we looked at in point 3 above. Clean thinking suggested that rethinking and deconstructing addiction may be required to provide the necessary motivation to stop addictive behavior, and that language and metaphor frame our understanding of addiction. Finally, changing a person's environment may be needed for addictive behavior to change. This is the idea that it's not only the drugs or the addictive activity, but also the set and setting. And I would just like to end from a quote from this book, The Fix by Damian Thompson. Our most daily habits can quickly become obsessions that move beyond our control. Damian Thompson, who himself struggled with a range of addiction, argued that human desire is in the process of being reshaped. Shunning the concept of addiction as a disease, he shows how the manufacturers are producing substances like iPads and computer games that we like too much and supplement traditional addictions such as alcohol, drugs, and gambling. He argues that addictive behavior is a substitute for family and work bonds that are being swept away by globalization and urbanization. So all this leads to the final point: how can we respond to the challenges posed by addiction?